I've been on a kick lately writing about movies I saw this year, and I figured I might as well write a video for each of my 5 favorite films before the year is over. I've already talked about Superman and Sinners, but I've got 2 more after this one that are probably both contenders for my personal film of the year. But there's one movie I really should make a video about that I haven't yet. When I was in school, I had to read a lot of postmodernist fiction for some of my classes, and Thomas Pynchon's Vinland was among them. So when I heard one of my favorite directors was adapting the book to film, obviously I was quite open to seeing it. I have a pretty open-minded stance on adaptations, often feeling we don't value the willingness of creatives to make important changes to works enough, because they're creating something new, which gives them a lot of opportunities to do something interesting with it. This film definitely did that, but it did it in a specific way that very few people seem to have presented in their reviews and discussions of this film. I wanted to do that with you today. I want to talk about one battle after another and about what I think a lot of people may have missed. First, I want to spend a little time talking about some various takes I've seen. I want you to trust that I'm not doing this to put anyone on blast, as usually I just talk about a movie on its own terms. But I do think some of these perspectives are sort of consistently lacking one particular thing. And maybe by drawing together some prominent examples, you can see what I mean. Starting out, I'd like to look at a piece for Vulture by Alison Willmore, which, like a lot of these pieces, has a strong point to make. She summarizes the core of Paul Thomas Anderson's inspiration quite well. Quote, "One Battle After Another is Anderson's second riff on Pynchon, loosely inspired by his novel Vinland. But unlike the director's first, Inherent Vice, this new film isn't about the curdled aftermath of 60s idealism. He untethers the story from the Reagan era and drags it into the 21st century, where his characters free migrants from detention centers and plant bombs in the offices of anti-abortion congressmen. Rather than ruminating on innocence lost, it presents the ebbs and flows of activism as part of a larger pattern. Participants wash out, or sell out, or get arrested, then get replaced by new blood, a cycle that comes with a measured optimism in addition to a body count." I've seen a lot of people name-drop Vinland and Pynchon as a fun fact when discussing, reviewing, or interpreting this film, but I think the truth about this movie and about what it means is really only accessible in the context of it being an adaptation when you talk about what Paul Thomas Anderson changed from the source material, because it engenders a certain question of why. Why did he make so many severe changes? I'm not against it, but importantly, Vinland is eminently adaptable. He didn't have to, but he changed it anyway. So again, why did he do that, and what does it mean for the film? One thing that Kit Stone wrote for Hugh Watched It also points generally to what in the book is being missed here. Quote, "There have been several hot takes on her character online. Some suggest Perfidia was suffering from postpartum depression when she abandoned her family. But the film makes it clear that even before giving birth, a disconnect existed. In a campfire scene, Pat tells Deandra, Regina Hall, honk for Jesus, save your soul, that Perfidia behaves as if she isn't even pregnant. Ultimately, Perfidia is arrogant and reckless. To be clear, Perfidia is not a hero. She was down for the revolution when it cost her nothing. The moment the battle demanded a price she wasn't willing to pay, her freedom, she abandoned the cause to save herself." At the end of the film, Willow reads a letter from her mother that some might argue gives Perfidia redemption. But regret doesn't equal salvation. Perfidia once had community, something to fight for, and a family to come home to. Now, forever on the run, she's alone, forced to be her own company with no one left to fight but herself. This is very close to how I see Perfidia's character, and I think it speaks to this writer's insight that she seems to have picked up on the core conflict within Perfidia's character and the way that it really drives the narrative. Writing for The Wrap, William Bibbiani's review picks up a similar thread. One Battle After Another stars Leonardo DiCaprio as a man with a lot of names, but we'll just stick with Bob. He's the explosives expert for a revolutionary group called the French 75, led by his girlfriend Perfidia Beverly Hills, Tiana Taylor. Perfidia is a charismatic figurehead and an insatiable sex addict, which to Anderson makes her dangerously irresponsible. Worse, she's also a sex criminal who forces the right-wing Colonel Stephen J. Lockjaw, Sean Penn, to pleasure himself at gunpoint during a raid." End quote. This is basically correct in my view, but it lacks the kind of nuance that referring to the source material would grant. For example, the sex addiction angle is present in Pynchon's novel, so this is less something Paul Thomas Anderson created and more something he maintained. Actually, while this is basically a huge issue with the film, it's also character-driven. One of my favorite reviews of this film was actually for Vanyaland by Nick Johnston, who said, "You can taste the missing fat in the I can't believe it's not Pynchon substitute. The lack of melancholy or context or introspection that gives the work its depth and richness." That's more broadly true of the film, but Perfidia is at the core of that problem. Writing for NPR, last one guys, I promise, Aisha Harris has a pretty strong take that I'd like to quote from at length here. Quote, One way of reading this is to put it in Audre Lorde's terms. Perfidia understands her erotic self, the measure between the beginnings of our sense of self and the chaos of our strongest feelings. As Lorde also described it, in touch with the erotic, I become less willing to accept powerlessness, or those other supplied states of being which are not native to me, such as resignation, despair, self-effacement, depression, self-denial. That rejecting of powerlessness comes through most strongly in Taylor's performance, which exudes confidence and vulnerability in a fleeting amount of screen time. But I'm not so sure the character as written winds up being all that much deeper than a character in your run-of-the-mill blaxploitation film from 50 years ago, and Perfidia certainly isn't the primary focus of One Battle, at least not her physical presence. The seeds are there. Through those early scenes, Anderson presents interesting ideas about liberation and personal sacrifice, especially the difficult choices Perfidia is forced to make as a black woman fighting oppression, which proves she's damned no matter what. Yet they whiz by, often in montage, a manner that ends up only skimming the headlines. As one of the other steadfast French 75 members, Regina Hall is even more criminally underused, so much so I wondered if some of her scenes were cut from the final running time of nearly 3 hours. Interiority is more readily rendered through Bob and Lockjaw, and, to a different but notable degree, the savvy Willa. I've seen a number of black female critics who have pointed out the way this film uses black women in its on-screen presence, and I think those critiques are maybe more valid than some people might at first assume. Outwardly, when you step back and look at the film, there's several black women in the cast, but only one who really acts out sexually or is fundamentally morally questionable in the context of the text. The blaxploitation comparison is the same one that occurred to me when watching it. This is effectively a film that has a secure place in the context of more mainstream blaxploitation films. A little more self-aware, a little more willing to wink at the audience in good humor, but not without that same history, that same cultural continuity. This is a microcosm of what makes One Battle After Another so interesting. I won't say it's a bad choice in the abstract, but contextually it's a questionable one, because of who this one character is. You see, in Pynchon's original Vinland, the story doesn't orbit Zoid, the book's version of Bob, nearly as much as the film follows Bob. His elevated screen time is the first thing I noticed. It's not an unwelcome change for reasons of Leonardo DiCaprio's acting skills, but it gives the game away a bit. The other figure who claims to be the father of the main character, Prairie, the book version of Willa, is Brock, the book version of Lockjaw. Vinland follows Prairie as she seeks the truth about her parents and the circumstances of her birth, going from her father Zoid to seeking out her mother Frenesi. Frenesi is kind of a piece of shit. Her backstory is she's basically fixated on sex to the point that she sold her group of revolutionaries out to the feds due to her attraction to Brock. This is why Paul Thomas Anderson's character is named Perfidia Beverly Hills. She might as well be named Classia Traitora. This is her continuity with Frenesi. Frenesi is a willful traitor who, right up until the time the book takes place, has been protected by Brock. You can see perhaps how this doesn't translate adequately to Perfidia and Lockjaw. Very few reviews place front and center the character's morally dubious qualities, unless they're implying the film has poor political commentary. But to my mind, that's skipping over the reason the politics of this film are questionable, which is that Vinland was an exploration of the failure of 60s-era radicals from inside the drug war and the Reagan administration. I've seen some critics say this film takes shots at both the far left and the far right, but that's sort of flattening an important distinction. One Battle After Another treats the political far left as if it's a bit silly or lacking in perspective, which is in keeping with the novel's depiction of specific characters, but it treats the far right as if it's evil. I'm not going to argue with that, it's a defensible perspective on white nationalism, but the film's depiction of the far left, specifically in absurd terms, is one of its most postmodern qualities. Postmodernism as a cultural movement describes the sensations we feel living at the end of history, as a liberal post-World War II consensus decays into austerity, and we fail to see how the rest of human history could ever be anything but this, like we're on a one-way trip to declination. Vinland is a great book in that context, specifically because it confronts the sense of chances that are lost to history. When Brock dies in the end after revealing to Prairie that he thinks he's her real father, she doesn't think to herself, oh good riddance, that guy was an awful DEA agent participating in the government's persecution of minorities, but instead she feels a sort of regret that he didn't take her away from all this. She's left behind, stranded in her moment in history, having been disillusioned with the mythology of the activism of the 1960s. I think a lot of people, and this time I really will say across political boundaries that this is true of many on the political right, but also some on the political left, really get postmodernism wrong. It's not a cultural plot to stop us from seeing how things were really great or could be again. It's a genuine engagement with a real sense of defeat we've been living in this entire time. Importantly, postmodernism's cultural purchase, its pervasive irony, self-commentary, and aversion to sincerity, has roused a lot of dissatisfaction in the 21st century. It does, in hindsight, seem to have chiefly been a tendency of the latter half of the 20th century, although gamers in the audience will note the common DNA shared with some properties like Borderlands or Disco Elysium. But what that means for our future is still unclear. I'm working on a much longer video that engages with this feeling, but I thought this film was a great opportunity to bring it up specifically, because Paul Thomas Anderson seems similarly dissatisfied with that feeling of a lost chance at revolution. This film still has faith in the 60s and faith in the future. It plays Gil Scott-Heron's The Revolution Will Not Be Televised. It has characters like Benicio del Toro's Sensei, who seem to legitimately honor Bob and Perfidia's group. It shows a present where it doesn't pay to be a white nationalist, and a future where persistence in the face of adversity is a virtue. In the end, Willa is greeted with the prospect of maybe meeting her mother once more. The future is a hopeful place. I don't think that's Pynchon. I think rather than adapting Vinland, what Paul Thomas Anderson did was make a refutation of Thomas Pynchon's work. The question in my mind is not whether he should try, but whether he succeeded. In some ways, Vinland was more forward-thinking than One Battle After Another, despite being 3.5 decades older. The emphasis on the drug war as a profound policy of government persecution can be juxtaposed with how Bob's pot habit genuinely seems to interfere with his cognitive abilities. At an even greater level of contrast stands the book's portrayal of Frenesi as a pretty unprincipled figure, to say the least, which is copacetic with the sexual component of her characterization, with the film's portrayal of Perfidia, whose motivations seem frankly at odds with her characterization. She retains Frenesi's core character flaws, but is presented in some contexts as a principled revolutionary who only rats out her comrades under legal pressure, whereas that wasn't the impression of Frenesi I got back when I read Vinland whatsoever. In a weird way, it seems like One Battle After Another suffers from Paul Thomas Anderson's unwillingness to let Perfidia be a bad person. She's concerned about whether she's a bad person, and she's trying not to be in her own way, or at least that's the read I got on her in the film. Maybe Tiana Taylor is too charismatic, but because Perfidia isn't really presented as the traitor she otherwise would be if she were Frenesi, she loses the thing that makes her feel like a real person. Instead, she ends up looking like a flawed and even failed, but otherwise principled black female revolutionary. I can see why Paul Thomas Anderson would want to make a movie like that in this cultural moment, but it's odd because he kept Frenesi's other character traits. This film has two Perfidias, postmodern adaptation Perfidia and hopeful leftist Perfidia. I think a lot of people have overlooked the sheer degree to which this writing decision transforms and problematizes the narrative. Paul Thomas Anderson clearly wanted to direct a movie that was more hopeful. He clearly wanted people to have a sense that we should take the failures of the past and build on them, focusing on what might be as an implication of what wasn't, instead of the sense of loss that such a moral fable implies. I do think postmodernism often presents us with an implicit moral fable. It's the culture of this era of capitalism, but not necessarily an affirmation of it. But there's a break here nevertheless. Vinland wanted Thomas Pynchon's reader to engage with that feeling of loss. One Battle After Another instead wants us to see the way that failures of the past compound into potential for the future. That's not a bad thing. It's certainly presented in a compelling manner. But the question remains as to whether what we're seeing is coherent. In the context of the film's seeming desire to imagine a future for us all despite our circumstances, and how that cuts against its need to treat Bob as its most central character, as opposed to Willa, where Pynchon's instinct was to take the opposite approach, I'm not so sure. Maybe that's a pretty harsh criticism. I'm sure letting this film simmer in my mind a bit more will help me know for sure how I feel about it. Beyond everything I said here, it's a great movie, definitely a movie of the year contender more generally, and it has that kind of desperate violence and anxious atmosphere that a lot of Paul Thomas Anderson's best work has. As someone who considers There Will Be Blood among her favorite films, I enjoyed it. If you liked this video, please do consider subscribing for more like it. If you've seen One Battle After Another, please let me know what you thought of it in the comments. Until next time, if you'd like to support my work, I have a Patreon and channel memberships open, but I just appreciate you giving me your time. Thanks so much.